Welcome back. Last time we did quite a few definitions. We talked about defining the social sciences, media, and citizenship. This time, what I'd like to do is start putting that all together, specifically by talking about an overview of some of the current issues regarding our relationship between media and democratic citizenship. And to do that, I'd like to point out what are some of the problems that we're dealing with today and some of the consequences of those problems. So it's basically an overview of two of the chunks that I told you about in the overview of the class. Remember, we talked about how there's four different chunks of the class that we'll be talking about concepts and definitions, putting everything into context. Then we're going to talk about what's actually happening in the media right now. What are industry practices that are having an effect on citizenship? And then we'll talk about what's our role in all this, and then finally action steps. So what I'd like to overview here is a little bit about the industry practices, and then a little bit about our relationship with the media. So before we get into that, I do want to reiterate one of the assumptions that we're making in discussing this topic. And the assumption is democracy is a good thing. You can have a reasonable discussion about whether democracy is good or bad for society. And again, because we have to put some kind of boundary on what we're talking about this semester, otherwise we'll be all over the place, we have to kind of settle on some assumptions. And one of those assumptions is we're aiming for democracy. That is the goal. And that democracy works best when there is more of it, meaning that more people participating improves democracy. Improved democracy improves the health and well-being of the citizenry. So again, you can have a reasonable debate about that. This is just not the place to do it. So one of the rhymes that we've seen, like something that's happened over and over again through history, is that every time there's some kind of new media communication technology developed, people get pretty excited thinking like, this is going to be it. This is going to increase people's knowledge. It's going to increase their political participation. You know, when the printing press was invented, people were like, this is great. We're going to really disseminate a lot of good knowledge. When the penny press was invented, people thought, this is great. We're going to increase a lot of knowledge. I remember when the internet became common use, and I, amongst many other people, thought, this is going to be great, access to really good information. And what we see happening over and over again throughout history is that these wonderful hopes and expectations that we have don't really come to fruition the way that we hoped that they would. And a lot of it comes down to those two topics we're covering, industry issues and our as individual people, the way that we consume media. So let's start by talking about some of the main problems and consequences as related to industry. To start, news consumption has unfortunately decreased significantly. If you're interested, I have all of these PDFs connected that you can check them out. I even highlighted things that I thought were really important. But the main thing here that Neblo is discussing is that lots of people are having a really hard time just understanding what is the system, like what is this democratic system that we're trying to keep afloat. And one of the big problems that we're dealing with is a lack of critical thinking. So that's why places like The Ohio State University are focusing so hard on trying to get people to improve their critical thinking skills. Another problem that we've come across is that newspapers are disappearing. And let me go ahead and bring up that PDF for you in case you are interested in that. But we've found that this is a huge financial problem that we're having with news consumption and newspapers disappearing. There's been a decline across the board, and a lot of that is because of the financial issues with newspapers. There's also a real lack of practical information in the media. Practical information is something that's actionable, like where do I vote? Or what is a town hall meeting? Where do they take place? How do I get involved in that? And this is an example actually of something positive, like a positive example from the Dispatch, where the author provided some information asking or answering those, really clear questions about how to participate. But those are unfortunately quite rare. There are also a lot of industry issues in terms of the actual creation of the actual media. So not only is it decreasing, but what we have isn't always that great. And one of the reasons for that is just financial. What makes the most money for a media outlet is not always what's best for democracy. Some examples include social media. What they benefit from financially is including information that makes people angry, that makes people scared, information that is salacious, and information that, quite frankly, can be dangerous. One example of that is that Twitter allowed many false posts that were related to the January 6th attack, and that may have contributed to the attack in the first place, and that afterwards it may have contributed to people misunderstanding how bad it really was. Another example of an industry issue that we see is just errors in newspapers. Some of these are intentional. We would call that disinformation. Some of them are just mistakes, because with the 24-hour news cycle, newspapers are going to make mistakes sometimes. One of the big questions that we like to ask in terms of, is a newspaper professional journalism or not, is how do they fix those mistakes? What's their policy? How do they share that information that there was a mistake, that they corrected it? And unfortunately, we find that these do not happen evenly across the board. The example that I have for you here is an article that was looking at corrections in different newspapers. I think they used the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And one of the big problems with that, and that's from 2018, but this is still the case today, I cannot find a policy from the Wall Street Journal on their specific protocol for correcting errors. I can find it for the New York Times, but I cannot find it for the Wall Street Journal. And so that's a real problem, is that I don't know, how do they correct errors? Do they correct errors? What is the policy there? So that is a real problem in the industry, as is bias reporting. And the article that I have here for an example for you is about ownership. So in this particular article, they were again looking at the Wall Street Journal, and it was a really interesting content analysis. They looked at the Wall Street Journal before and after it was owned by Rupert Murdoch, and they found significant differences in what was reported, especially in the editorials. So certainly that ownership issue can make a real difference in the information that they are sharing with people. Another problem that we see with industry is outreach. Again, this is a financial thing where news outlets are sometimes incentivized to reach out to certain segments of the population over others. If you are so interested, I have a video clip here for you from an old comedy show from 2020. I'm not going to show it to you because I don't think you need to watch it to understand the gist of it. But the main point of this comedy clip is that he's using satire comedy to point out the problems with how the Asian population in America is very often not reached out to by political campaigns. Another problem that we run into with the industry is that despite the fact that the goal of the media is to act as this unofficial check and balance, we don't always see that happening in the real world. What I mean by unofficial checks and balances is that our media here in America is not a part of the government, and it's not supposed to be. So, we have our three branches of government. They do checks and balances on each other, or at least they're supposed to. And the media is not an official part of that for a reason. If the media is part of the government, then the media can very much be influenced by the government. So instead, the idea is that they're acting as an unofficial check and balances. Some of the issues that we run into with that, though, is that journalism in general can be dangerous, and so can being a poll worker. I have some examples of those things that I can share with you. So if I scroll on down to this one was about how dangerous it is to be a journalist. This was updated, it looks like, in 2018, and that was a time that we started to see a decrease in how safe people are being a journalist here in America. But we also see the same things happening abroad, is that journalism is not as safe as it used to be. We also find that there's a real danger for people who are working as poll workers, that that can be they did a content analysis of 850 threatening messages to poll workers. It was really quite disturbing. This can be problematic because we as human people sometimes take for granted the fact that all these problems that are taking place in the industry are going to be recognized, that we're going to find out about them. One example that I can share with you is about Watergate. So people this day and age are pretty familiar with the Watergate scandal and Richard Nixon's role in it. And that's great. That's wonderful that lots of people are familiar with it. The problem, of course, is that because people are so familiar with that, that they just sort of work under the assumption that we were always going to find out about Richard Nixon's tapes and the break-in at the Watergate offices and things like that. But we really were not guaranteed to find out about that. It was investigative journalism that made that happen. And so without that investigative journalism, we never would have found out about the Watergate scandal. And it really makes you wonder, like, what has happened in the world that we haven't found out about. Another example that I can share with you is about those checks and balances and public integrity. During the pandemic, businesses received loans from the government, PPP loans, and basically, whenever the government is giving large amounts of money to people, it's nice if we know where that money is going, that there is some kind of transparency there. And there wasn't initially. Hardly any transparency about where that money was going until, again, investigative journalism really pushed to have that transparency. So we certainly need investigative journalism. Another reason why we need investigative journalism is that it gives us a basis for our shared cultures and values. I think, again, Watergate is a good example of that. At this point in time, so many people are familiar with the break-in at the Watergate Hotel that it's become a basis of our culture for which we compare other things, right? So many new contemporary scandals are referred to as something something gate because of the Watergate scandal. And so those shared values, that shared historical understanding really helps us to compare things that are happening today in a way that sort of keeps us on the same page, that we all have those things that we can talk about. That can be problematic, though, when we don't have that kind of shared background and information. And sometimes we don't. An example that I wanted to share with about this is all the different definitions that people have of being a good patriot. Those of you who have taken my history class probably know that this is one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass. And he just said, "The best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebuked her for her sins, and he her worst enemy who, under the specious garb of patriotism, seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend them." So basically, he's saying a value that we should have as a society is to find problems in our country and then work to fix them, not to just, sweep them under the rug or pretend that they don't exist. An example of how these shared values and cultural issues did not work out well in the media was during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's an article here from the New York Times if you are so interested in checking it out. But I'll summarize the main problem for you is that this was a health issue that really should not have been politicized. We see that in countries that it wasn't as politicized, they had much better health outcomes than we did here in the United States. And part of the reason that it was so politicized is that the media had these two very different values that they were advocating for or against in a way that politicized an issue that should have not been political. Another reason why it's really important that we have this good quality journalism and media in general is so that we can adapt to things that change in the future. Media communication technology changes very, very quickly. An example that I have for that is facial recognition. It's advanced so rapidly that our laws have not kept up with it. And there are some instances where facial recognition can be a good thing for democracy, and there are some instances where it can be a bad thing for democracy. So we really need to study these things, we need to do research, and we need to make sure that our laws are keeping up with the current conditions and constantly adapting. And without good access to high quality information, we can't adapt properly. So those are some of the issues with industry, and I wanted to tie in some of the concerns that we have with our role as citizens as related to our media use. One is that education for citizenship is on the decline. So, a lot of people, like I said, have a hard time understanding what is happening in the world around them. What is my role as a citizen? How can I learn more? And like I said, one of the best things that you can do for that is to become very good at critical thinking. Another issue that we have with media and viewership is that one of the goals that the media has is to be informative of the general public. Another goal that the media has is to actually inform our politicians as well. So, a lot of politicians get their news information from the same sources that we do. So, we need to make sure that they are getting the right information. An example of a time that of a situation or a topic where a lot of politicians have incorrect information is about critical race theory. Again, I have a clip from a TV show if you would like to check it out, but I will summarize it for you so that you get the main point. A lot of states are creating or proposing laws banning teaching of critical race theory. And the problem with that is that the actual politicians creating those laws very often have no idea what critical race theory is. Critical race theory has historically been taught to graduate students. So it makes sense that your everyday person and your everyday politician doesn't know what it is. So, unfortunately, there were a lot of instances of the media, especially Fox News, giving incorrect information about what critical race theory is. They were saying things like critical race theory teaches children that being white is a bad thing, that children should be embarrassed about being white and things like that, that are nothing to do with critical race theory. It's not in the theory. But because, like I said, this is a theory that has been primarily taught to graduate students, of course, the general public doesn't know what it is, doesn't know what it's all about. So when they see that false information in the media, of course, they think that it's true. And unfortunately, it's not even just the general public being exposed to that incorrect information, it's actually public servants as well. So another issue is that TV in general doesn't do a very good job at increasing people's knowledge about current events. Personally, I prefer print news. I read 3 newspapers a day, every day, and I personally don't get my news from television just because it has been problematic in the past. Another problem with viewership is that people are not watching local news as much as they used to or reading local news as much as they used to. And there's a real conundrum there when it comes to the money. So, especially with good quality investigative journalism, that is expensive. So, in order to have that journalism take place, like a newspaper, like our local Columbus Dispatch, they need money to do that. And so, in America, because we like to keep the media and the government separated, we don't have government funding for those kinds of newspapers. That's a good thing because if the government was funding the newspapers, then the government may also influence the newspapers and what they're publishing about. It's also a bad thing, though, because it means that these newspapers don't have funding. And so what we see is an information paywall where people who are able to afford newspaper subscriptions to good quality newspapers have better access to news in general, but especially local news as well. I was going to mention, if you're interested in it, people are working on trying to find some solutions for that, and some of them are really quite creative. For example, this article here had some ideas like give everybody a tax credit that they can use specifically for a subscription to whatever newspaper they want to subscribe to, or have these policies in place to help nonprofit newspapers grow. Lots of really cool, interesting stuff that they're coming up with as potential solutions. So, in general, summarizing that all up, it is really important that we think about this relationship between media and democracy because it impacts your right to health, your right to safety, your right to education, and your right to being able to participate in the policy making decisions that are very important for your life. So, thank you so much for your attention and have a great rest of your day.